Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Adam Berger. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Netrix. Thank you for joining us today for our topic, which is on securing your data in the era of Gen AI. For those who didn't see the last webinar, we had a broader topic on overall security around Gen AI. We talked about governance, some strategies for how to secure Gen AI in the broader space of security. During that webinar, we actually talked a lot about data security, and it's such a deep topic that goes pretty wide for a lot of companies that we decided to do a second webinar that hops into the topic around data security. For that topic specifically, many companies today already lack the data security strategy that was robust enough to effectively secure data in a way that was meaningful. And Gen AI is sort of compounding that concern. Surprise, when you turn Gen AI on, it has access to all of your data and is actually shedding a little more visibility around the problem. And so today we're actually going to hop into securing Gen AI as it relates to data security in a bit more depth. And for that, we have two awesome SMEs here today. We have Rich Lilly, who is a technologist and one of our field CTOs at Netrix for security. He has over 25 years of consulting experience. He is a leading SME in the Microsoft security, compliance, and identity space. Also a Gen AI security thought leader. He's joined us for a few of our topics recently, actually, Gen AI specifically on the last webinar. Also, delighted to have Chris Clark here as a manager over our Microsoft security team here at Netrix. Chris brings 20 years of consulting experience, and he does specialize in Microsoft security for over the last decade, and works with many of our clients today in this space. So really delighted to have you both so you can help bring some depth to this topic. So to kind of kick us off, last time we did go kind of the broader topic around governance, some protection strategies, and things like user education, how to get your arms around Gen AI. And today, similar theme, but really much more focused on data governance and data security as it relates to Gen AI. So what I'd like to do to kick us off, Rich, if you can maybe just help us fill this problem out a little bit more. Why should companies be concerned about their data security as it relates to Gen AI, and kind of what people should be thinking about when they're looking at that?
Yeah, I appreciate it. There's a lot to think about, right? So when we think of the age of, what this has been for years, a lot of folks have a lot of stale data that sits out there. So, in the past, to find and surface that information required human touch and required, someone to go find something and do something with it. And the reality is, with many of the AI platforms today, having access to that data in whatever forms that may be, a local repository, a file share, Office 365, et cetera, being able to query and touch that data in a much quicker, more efficient way is ultimately what has caused kind of this uprising of fear of data security now. And it comes from a lot of different areas. I think a lot of folks may just think of it from like an outsider threat type of scenario. Certainly there's the insider type threat as well. I think the first one that we probably see the most common, and I know Chris will echo this because he does a lot of Copilot and similar platform security engagements, is inadvertent sharing of data through generative AI interactions. The interesting thing here is, again, because I have access to query or ask questions of or reason over large sets of data, this creates a paradigm where someone may be able to ask a question, whether it's in a malicious or non-malicious nature, and surface information that may not be intended, right? And the most common examples we use almost every day are going to be, what is the salary of all the employees, right? And there are some protections built into most AI platforms for this, but can't stop all type of interactions. So whether it's the salary information or whether it's due to like M&A, if these things weren't secured in the repositories that Copilot or ChatGPT Enterprise or others can touch, that data becomes available on your behalf, and that can be used again in malicious and non-malicious ways. Again, non-malicious would be an accidental, hey, we display something from the Gen AI engine that was not originally intended, and this does happen. The other would be malice intent, right? Someone potentially trying to leverage insider risk type situations where they're trying to find data and use that data for whatever purpose that may be, getting a promotion, sending it to a competitor, sending it to an actor, right, a malicious actor. So this one is probably the number one scenario we talk about. That also then leads to oversharing and access risks as well. So we've kind of we've kind of dealt with this for many years within solutions like SharePoint and OneDrive, but it's not just beholden to those. It's also Box and Dropbox and other platforms as well. Is that folks will just have content shared and maybe they create an anonymous link. Well, unfortunately, if I create that anonymous link and it gets emailed out and that gets intercepted or that gets accidentally shared in a chat with a broader audience than it should, because it's not targeted in an individual like Adam or like Chris, this can be accessed by people that may not be intended. And kind of both of these things together create a situation where there is potentially risky exposure of data. The other one we also see is data leakage. So this kind of falls a little bit in line with the sensitive data part as well, but again, unintended data sharing can lead to consequences. So, again, whether that be related to sharing some sensitive internal communications, whether that be sharing something about acquisition, especially if you're like a publicly held company or a publicly traded company, this becomes extremely concerning. These can affect share prices and market value and things like that. And again, there's both on both sides of this. There's going to be kind of the malicious side, maybe from an attacker that was able to get in, but also insider information can be a part of that as well. We also talked in our last webinar a bit about kind of the lack of governance and visibility. So a lot of organizations, they kind of start with this mentality of, well, we don't know how we want to use GenAI, but we know we need to use it. This kind of creates an interesting scenario where is it the business defining the requirements or is it the technical teams driving the requirements? So we often will recommend, and we talked about this a little bit in our last webinar too, but I'm kind of doubling down on it, is create a governance committee, make sure they have the visibility into the goals of the business, kind of define the strategy. And those are a little bit less technology driven, but they definitely have to go in pair with technology. They're, it's kind of two sides of that, the policy making and the enforcement, where the tooling is going to play a part of that role as well. And that's certainly something that has to be thought about and talked about as a part of overall data protection strategy. The other part of this as well is also starting down that journey of data classification. Chris will talk about this in a little bit as well, but making sure you have a taxonomy, making sure you have a plan to retire data that maybe with some specific labeling or sensitivity options as well, because this also leads to needs around regulatory and compliance exposure. For as long as I can remember, and I've been doing this for quite some time, there have been written policies by different, governing boards and bodies around data retention. We've seen this in financial services for data retention up to 7 years, and some others could be less, could be more. Some businesses could have their own that don't actually require compliance or regulatory, but they do it for other reasons that are, specific to their organization, industry, or maybe having to work with the U.S. government. So on this side as well, how do we make sure that the data that is 7 years old or dated at that point isn't being serviced as something that's new, right? And the most common example, again, I use is if you go ask ChatGPT or use Copilot, et cetera, and ask something, I want the most relevant current data. Well, if I don't have that data managed and governed in the proper way, it could be returning something that's actually no longer valid or providing false information that may not be something I want. So, all these pieces really play into overall data protection strategy. But, I would say that, there's different ways and tooling to help achieve these things. But all of the examples I just gave are questions I'm being asked by my customers today. And, again, there are technology ways and also policy ways to help address them as a part of this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rich, for filling that out a bit. I think, wearing my CISO hat for a minute, the larger concern I hear is really that sort of unintentional access or unintentional exposure, right? Where there's good intention to use Gen AI for business processing for whatever the needs are of the organization, but just because of maybe existing risks in the environment, you're actually compounding that problem, right? So yeah, it's concerning. So if we talk about discovery for a minute, if we think about okay, how do we sort of open up when it comes to data security risks? I kind of think of two different areas, like what tools are being used, and how do we maybe find out, and then also how do we understand that risk as it relates to what data is exposed. So if we kind of focused on just getting our arms around Gen AI tools. I know we talked a little bit about this last time, Rich, but just to kind of refresh and then maybe talk about some techniques. If we're looking at understanding what GenAI is used so that we can understand how that may interact with our data. What are some of the ways that you see, working with our clients that are useful for doing a discovery effort around GenAI?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot of tools in the mix, right? And these are not necessarily vendor specific, so I'll kind of broaden it to start and talk about a couple specific ones in a second. I think from a broad level perspective, leveraging some type of DNS or proxy information, usually you'll find this of the likes of, the Umbrellas or Zscalers of the world, to be able to show you what sites and services some are accessing is a good start. It's going to help you identify is Gemini being used, is Grok being used, is Copilot being used simply by the URL visits. And that's a part of the puzzle, right? The other part of that is, we talked about this a little bit last time as well, but a lot of vendors are just starting to build this into their sites. So it's not necessarily a dedicated GenAI function or a URL that says, hey, I'm using ServiceNow's website. There's always going to be GenAI usage. It's going to be dependent on your implementation and licensing and things like that. These underlying Gen AI, chat bots and other things like that are just as relevant. So both of those pieces are definitely important to kind of start with. Outside of leveraging tools like, proxies and filters, et cetera, we're kind of seeing a resurgence right now of CASB solutions because CASBs operate in a very similar manner as well. So again, we can intercept, a quantified known list of SaaS apps, how they're being used, to identify, what those are. Not necessarily always what the data movement is between them, but that's really where some of these other tools then come into play. So in a lot of cases now, we have opportunities to leverage endpoint solutions. Some cases, this may be a mixture of your EDR tools. In more cases now, it's going to be tools like Endpoint DLP, which again, Chris will talk about some of the specific ones that we recommend here in a little bit. But in these cases, we can actually reason over the data movement. What is the source of the data, such as a sensitively labeled Word document? And is that content going into a source we don't trust or don't approve? And that could mean two different things, right? We can just block access to non-approved sources. And this is the funnel concept we talked about a little bit last time. The other option is to allow it, but monitor or block, something coming in from a specific sensitivity type or a label or function. And again, tools are a part of the equation, but also, it's policy. And I think the most important that we've talked about, I think on a couple of different webinars now, but I recommend talking to your people. I would beg to say in probably 90+% of the organizations I talk to, whether they have a Gen AI policy or a strategy or a business function or not today, Gen AI is in use in your organization. Could be as simple as someone going out to a free ChatGPT account and plugging in enterprise data. It could be as complex as someone trying to spin up an enterprise account and doing a lot more with it. You're not really going to know this until you start to use some of the data from the tools to, understand the visits and the interactions. But also, it's good to learn from your employees. How are they using Gen AI to help make their jobs better? One of the things I talk about, and I know Chris does as well quite a bit, is we don't want IT to be a blocker. They should always be an enabler. And I know it's something we fought with in security for my entire career, at least. But the better we understand how they want to use it and they are using it today, the better that we can maybe model some different business scenarios and things that are a little bit more secure with the tooling that we approve them to have access to do that in. And when I say approve, I mean these tools have regulatory and compliance controls. We've got audit capabilities. They integrate with some of our enterprise search and audit functions. These are all things that, again, once we kind of funnel them down this proper path, we can give them a solution that they should be using and should work. And it's something that, again, is a struggle right now, but, talking to the users, surveying them, kind of observing what they're doing, having open discussions with them is a really effective way, more so than just looking at, leveraging tools to kind of, guess what the users are doing. And certainly there's plenty of other vendors and solutions out there. I mentioned a couple of them already. Again, you've got proxy solutions, you've got CASB solutions. I know in a little bit here, I'll kind of mention all the different pieces that come into play, but we'll start talking here in a bit about some of the Microsoft stack of products, some of which you may have access to today to help with that as well.
Yeah, I think, Rich, when we talk about what Gen AI tools are in use, right? We talked about unintentional exposure, but the Gen AI tools themselves may not be produced by vendors where you can rely on their security. You tie that back to tools that integrate with enterprise tooling and governance internally, and I think that's a huge piece of just even if your own data security strategy is not sound, if you have access to a Gen AI tool that you can't trust your organization or may not be able to integrate with it, that's a big concern. And so yeah, definitely have that filled out a bit now, Rich. Now, if we shift over a little bit and now we talk about just purely even around data security, and it relates to like, okay, we know maybe we have a gap in an organization around data security. How do you quantify for a client looking at data exposure as it relates to Gen AI, and just how do you shine a flashlight on that, get a little understanding of maybe what that gap is so that the concern can be illustrated and a strategy can be built?
Yeah, I mean, from a high level, we'll kind of focus in on the Microsoft strategy because it's what we do and what we know very well. One of the areas that they have to start with, and Chris's team does an extensive amount of these, I'd say more so in the last 6 months and probably in the last year or two since this was introduced, is go and talk to your Microsoft representative about conducting data security engagement. The DSE, data security engagement, is a kind of standard approach to helping identify some of these things. And there's different components to that that'll kind of go into assessing kind of the current state and posture of your environment as it relates to securing your data. And this isn't necessarily Gen AI focused. However, there is a Gen AI component to it, given some of the different pieces and tools that kind of fit into that as well. Ultimately, we find the outcome of that is simply, even if it's just education, provide some value to our customers because they kind of understand how everything starts to plug in together. I think the one challenge that when we look at other vendors that have played in this space before outside of Microsoft, we may have to plug in 4 or 5, 6 different tools to do this today. The one thing that Microsoft has done very well, much like they've done on their security platforms under Defender over the last couple of years, they've tried to bring this all into a singular platform approach, being Purview now. And Purview is really about protecting the data estate overall. And now, in recent months or a year or so, it's kind of now expanded into, these functions to help secure Gen AI as well. And there's a lot of components that kind of play into that. So in Purview, there's a lot of different products with the name Purview in them. What we see from a Gen AI security perspective, and again, Chris will go into the details here more in just a little bit, but looking at leveraging Purview's information protection scanner as one piece to scan legacy data stores. So this could be your file shares, this could be your on-prem SharePoint sites, mostly kind of for that legacy data set. And let's be honest, that's still out there. A lot of our clients aren't 100% cloud modern, data storage and leveraging SharePoint and OneDrive today. So the reality is that data is going to have to sit somewhere. So leveraging that, in addition to leveraging the stuff that's built into M365, again, there's extremely tight integrations from Purview directly in with Exchange Online, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams. So, when I talk about the data estate, is really all of those things. But technically, that legacy data estate is the one that usually ends up being a little bit more difficult. And again, we can talk in a little bit about kind of why that is. We also are seeing right now kind of this uplift in discussion around endpoint data loss prevention. For, I would say, years, there were kind of a couple of big name players in this space that everyone was really aware of. They looked for basically sensitive information types, the format of a credit card number, the format of a ABAN or social security number, driver's license number, things like that. Now endpoint DLP plays other roles now as well, other than just picking up on sensitive information types. We're looking for labeled content. We're looking for the source and destination of copy and paste of a print of a send to or a share function out of a browser. These are all things that are becoming more important than just looking for a specific type matching or regular expression matching of a specific sensitive information type. We also see insider risk management. So this is rolled up under Purview some time ago now. But I know we talked about not all data security risks are outsiders. This is kind of looking at and using telemetry from solutions that we've already talked about, Endpoint DLP, Defender XDR, and its kind of subsequent Defender platforms, and looking at different signal, trying to make reason over some suspicious patterns or actions that may be potentially threatening to the business, and surfacing those to you in an easy way, right? Otherwise, it's me combing through my EDR logs to see all the copy and paste operations to a USB drive, or it's looking for all the share links created off of a SharePoint document. This kind of does a lot of that heavy lifting for you in scenarios that's kind of based on some very specific algorithms to look at the riskiness of a situation. Newly introduced, and we talked about this a bit in our last webinar as well, but earlier this year, Microsoft kind of rebranded their AI Hub tool, which was in preview for some time, to DSPM for AI. And there are two different DSPMs. Today, we'll be talking about DSPM for AI specifically. And there's a function in there that does something very similar to Insider Risk, but from a GenAI usage perspective. Do I see a user working in confidentially labeled documents, sharing that file in WhatsApp or copying it out to an unauthorized location? Do I see new usage of GenAI engines that have not been approved by our CASB tool, for instance? This is kind of a role of kind of a governor of kind of these different scenarios around the usage of GenAI. Certainly, also one that can't be forgotten that's probably not talked about enough is everything that happens in M365 is logged, right? This historically goes to the Purview audit log, or in some cases, other M365 audit sources. But the Purview audit log has a lot of information in it. Who labeled a file? When was it labeled? Did they unlabel the file? How was that file shared? Who and where was it consumed by if they're outside the organization? This represents a large amount of extremely valuable information, especially if there's like a data security risk or an event. There's a lot of things that are just built into that. And then two, the Purview Activity Explorer. This is another one that my opinion is it's not talked about quite enough, but I have the ability of, in a very easy, like kind of, tree branch type scenario, digging out down into different sensitive information types into my data that's already in SharePoint, in OneDrive, and Exchange, and be able to kind of understand what is the risk to the business of specific types of sensitive information. These are some of the different tools that kind of play into it. I think the other kind of parts that we look at as well is looking for using some of these tools to help identify shadow AI usage. So again, whether it's a tool like Defender for Cloud Apps, whether it's conditional access, whether it's Purview, et cetera, how do I identify if a new emerging AI platform is being used and what type of data is moved to and from it? There are pieces of the tools I just mentioned that will kind of go into assessing what that is. The other thing that we talk about too from a business perspective is looking also at running regular workshops, right? I think I see the evolution almost weekly or monthly, I guess in some cases, to the AI engines, to what they can do. We've seen this recently with ChatGPT and some of the new models that have been released. But things are evolving quickly. When I remember when using ChatGPT, for instance, when it first came out, and even Copilot to some extent, we're really just getting return text. Now we're talking about AI image generation. We're talking about audio generation. We're talking about video generation. So, these workshops are important because as Gen AI evolves, you have to evolve your policies, your communications to your users, and the technologies to help support them as well. And then the other is, looking at, specific exploits. So there's numerous documents out there from CISA and other organizations that talk about the exploitability of Gen AI, whether it be things like model poisoning, whether it be things like, false training and other things. But looking at some of these commonly exploitable scenarios and making sure you have the protections in place to identify, if there could be a bad actor, for instance, is poisoning your data, which could result in things that you don't want. Providing you false data you're using in a report to a customer is not a good thing. But this is the reality of where some of the modern threat actors are and kind of what they're doing out there. And I would say last but not least, because again, I've talked about a lot of the different vendors and tools in here. There's also some vendors like AvePoint, which kind of offer specific solutions around Gen AI and data security that can certainly help with the identification and enforcement of some of these things as well, in conjunction with some of the other Microsoft tools. So, again, it's a lot, right? And we don't expect everyone to kind of jump into all these pieces right away. I think it's really meeting kind of you where you are at in your journey, and you're going to be in a different area of maturity probably in all these areas, but the tools do exist and there are ways to help you, no matter where you're starting off today.
Yeah, I like, Rich, you did put outside of the tooling some focus on business strategy, organization, and a lot of people, security, it's a tendency to want to go into tools because at the end of the day, you do need those to help quantify and perhaps prevent or detect or prevent and detect and then respond. But business strategy is something we talked about a lot in the last one, and on here of just really understanding that usage, and then looking at what tools can maybe adopt and help with that strategy. And yeah, what I liked also, I heard, Rich, that we've seen working with the clients, Microsoft really does have probably the most robust suite that's sort of integrated with existing tooling. So kind of coming back to the comment you made about Gen AI and the integration with like enterprise tooling and how that can provide you greater benefit. Microsoft has really plugged Purview in to kind of all areas of the suite when it comes to the Microsoft tooling, but just how your business is actually accessing and interfacing with data. But to your point, it is kind of a deep topic when you're looking at it. So you had the recommendation of doing a structured engagement. It's definitely a crawl, walk, run approach, right? You're getting into this, understand the problem first, what's your business strategy, and how do you understand the gap. But that actual implementation, like you said, that's sort of like the big hairy beast when it comes to data security. And so for that, we want to kick this over to Chris to actually go a little bit deeper with a visual and some discussion on, okay, if you're going to look at a Purview engagement as it relates to data security, what does that actually look like, and how do you get into that, and then what are the various areas, and that'll, I think, if you break that down into chunks, as Chris is going to do for us here, it becomes a little more consumable, right? You don't eat the elephant all at once. You eat it in bites. So I'll transition over to Chris, if you wouldn't mind kind of getting us a little deeper on the topic of Purview and securing and governing data with it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Adam and Rich. So what's interesting is that my team has been working with clients for a very long time on deploying Purview. It's always essentially top of mind, but I think Gen AI has really brought things into the limelight, right? Essentially, so it's much more important. It's on everyone's radar. It's kind of stuff that you knew wanted to do, but sometimes it was pushed aside. But I think things like all the different AI tools that Rich was discussing and the different concepts there has really made it top of mind. So there's essentially kind of a three-pillar approach here that we can talk about, especially with Microsoft Purview. So Purview in the traditional sense has always been sensitivity labels, so labeling documents, DLP policies. There's things like insider risk, communications, compliance. But all these features and capabilities have now been wrapped around data security for Gen AI. So really one of the key pieces here in looking at kind of the first pillar is discovery, right? Rich was mentioning various tools that are needed to discover AI usage in your environment. Specifically with Microsoft Purview, one of the newer capabilities is called Data Security Posture Management for AI, or DSPM for AI. One of the key pieces here is onboarding endpoints into Purview. So that could be Windows 10, Windows 11, Mac OS, also Windows Server now. And part of that, deploying what's called a compliance extension. So this is all about gathering telemetry and data for AI usage in your environment. So I read a stat recently that the adoption of AI is the sharpest curve there's ever been for technology in general, right? It has been about a year since ChatGPT or other AI tools hit the scene, right? And it's an incredible S curve of adoption. So it's guaranteed that users in your environment are using some AI tools in some shape or form. So what you can do with Purview by onboarding your endpoints and deploying this compliance extension is feed this data into DSPM for AI. So we can see upwards to 1,000 different AI tools that are tracked within this mechanism, understanding data that's flowing through these, the data within the chat that's flowing through these as well, and just really what's going on from that standpoint. So that tool can be used directly to see, from a high level what's being used. That also feeds into some of the tools that Rich was mentioning, like Activity Explorer. So all the activity on the endpoint is captured as part of that. but it also leads you to kind of quick policy creation to the rest of the tools that we'll discuss. So it can recommend policies around AI and data security for, say, DLP or insider risk, even e-discovery. So it's an easy kind of framework that helps you on ramp to the other pieces in Purview. So this is definitely one of those key pieces from a discovery standpoint. Specifically for Copilot, there's what's called data assessments that is under DSPM for AI, and that allows you to look for overexposed sensitive data. So in the eyes to Copilot, one of the main kind of risks of deploying Copilot or even GenAI in general is that overexposed sensitive data can be found, pretty much instantly in these tools. So specifically with Copilot and the data assessment under DSPM for AI, it's looking for files that might have been mispermissioned in SharePoint, right? Which is very common. It's stuff that could have been hidden for a long time, and now it's finally being front and center because all of a sudden Copilot can find this information instantly again. So this can look for things like files that were shared with the everyone group or everyone external users, or anonymous links like Rich mentioned earlier, and also even organizational links. Once they're redeemed by that person, Copilot has access to that data as well. So very important tool there, as kind of part of the strategy around discovery. It leads to other tools like communications compliance, which can really look at generative AI as a whole. So it was generally used for things like profanity in the environment, or specific keywords, or insider kind of scenarios, but there are brand new generative AI categories. So things around just like Copilot experience, other enterprise AI apps like ChatGPT for enterprise, or other enterprise level ones, and even other AI apps that are brought into the picture and discovered by the DSPM side. So another piece is insider risk can actually use these types of signals as well. So insider risk management, another feature in Purview, uses what's called policy indicators. And these indicators generally were, endpoint indicators, maybe risky usage in SharePoint and OneDrive, a scenario where maybe someone gave their 2 weeks notice, and there's mass download, or creating rules for email externally. Now there's new specific AI or Gen AI data security related indicators. So things like Copilot experiences, again, other enterprise AI apps, those are now indicators that can be brought into insider risk management. And between kind of all these different components in Purview, you start to wrap your head around of what's being used in your environment, right? It's really the first step, right? If you think of it that way, or the first pillar here, and the overall framework. But ultimately, that can help you determine now what can you do next, right? Which leads us to the second pillar here.
I'd imagine, Chris, your average company walks through one of these assessments and uncovers some things. And is it fair to say your average implementation or average discovery session, the clients are finding more than they expected to see a lot of the time?
Yeah, definitely. So it, again, as I mentioned, it's an S curve of adoption, right? So all those tools are out there. If you don't have controls or insight into them, they're most likely being used. That's one thing, right? In specific regards to Copilot adoption, finding overexposed sensitive data has become a very interesting story. It's something that could have been there for years, right? If you mispermission something in SharePoint Online, or even in Teams lately, it's kind of a legacy tech that might have been mispermissioned, or whatever the case may be. These files have been there, but they're very hard to find, right? They're kind of hidden by default, if you will, right? Unless someone goes and looks for them. So the idea of Copilot being able to find them instantly has really brought everything to light. So you have files with social security numbers in them, payroll files, things that thought were secure and maybe under only HR or finance are in other locations. So we use the tools like data assessments, even the AppPoint tools as well to find this data, right, and very specifically show what's mispermissioned, what we can do about it with some of the other tools that kind of lead us to the protecting data side, which we'll talk about next there. But yeah, it's been surprising from that. So I wouldn't, don't expect everyone to be using AI tools, one, but this discovery piece will really help you kind of understand, what to do next. So
I suppose your average business leader is probably comes out of those sessions looking immediately saying, all right, Chris and team, how do we protect ourselves from this, right?
right.
So good transition point for the next step.
Yep. Yeah. So protecting data, kind of thinking in those pillars, like we mentioned, the second pillar of protecting data as part of the framework and strategy, leads us to things like sensitivity labels or information protection. So traditionally, you can deploy sensitivity labels from a holistic standpoint of view to all users with a groups of labels. And then maybe sensitive data has specific labels like highly confidential, confidential as an example. As part of that strategy now, something like Copilot takes on those sensitivity capabilities. So it's aware of sensitivity label, the permissions around those labels, potentially if you're using what's called permissions or encryption. So an example of that would be if I'm in a document that's labeled highly confidential, it's going to honor that those permissions, that sensitivity label itself, and allow you to use things like DLP, insider risk, other tools that are aware of those labels as well, to be able to set your policies and data protection components around it. So it really becomes, again, something I mentioned that a lot of businesses have pushed aside, trying to label all content or even label sensitive content. It just brings it more into the light, and it becomes a very important piece of the strategy here. So specifically with DLP, there's a Copilot DLP that can essentially remove data from Copilot search. So there's two new options around it. You can search for labeled content. So the idea behind that is maybe you're using a label that represents sensitive data. You want to hide it from Copilot so you can advance your Copilot deployment while not having the risk of finding that sensitive data instantly, essentially, as we said. And you can also just search for sensitive content directly instead of the label. So it allows you as that kind of stepping stone way to get to Copilot quicker, right, in a safe manner. But overall, the rest of GenAI, it really falls into endpoint DLP is one of the key features here. So Rich mentioned this component earlier, but onboarding your devices to endpoint DLP allows you to really have essentially all these different actions being tracked on the endpoint, right? So you can say, this labeled document has sensitive content, and I tried to copy it to a Gmail email as an example within the browser. So now that's outside of the rule set that either warn the user or prevent that from happening. But also the same thing with GenAI, right? So into a prompt in Grok or ChatGPT or Gemini, or whatever the case may be, you want to control the flow of that data, and endpoint DLP can specifically address that with the DLP policies applying directly to the endpoints there and those different actions. And then the last piece here that's listed is adaptive protection, which falls into insider risk. So insider risk itself has kind of different risk levels, right, that are determined based on your policies, within the feature itself. So you can say there's levels of minor, moderate, and elevated. So if a person, based on those indicators and signals, or user gets to that elevated role, you can enforce actions in other tools like conditional access or even DLP. So DLP can say, I can have a specific rule for elevated scenario, or a moderate scenario or a minor scenario, and they can each do various things, right, with the increasing scrutiny essentially. But as I mentioned before, all the indicators around AI now feed into this risk level, so it's directly related to helping secure Gen AI overall. So those are
Chris,
pretty much the main pieces for data protection. Sorry.
oh no, yeah, I was going to actually comment, Chris. You on the piece that you covered, you actually mentioned like this is the strategy or the area in the strategy where I think a lot of companies fall down, right? As far as like the implementation, getting labels in place, those are sort of like those foundational pillars needed to then leverage outcomes where an alert may pop up related to those labels or something's happening on an endpoint, right? And it's sort of that big chasm of how do we get this in place. So what are you seeing with our client base as far as what are some techniques to kind of get it going and then get into implementation here and kind of not just fall off into an implementation that never gets finished?
Yeah, it really, I think what Rich mentioned too was, you have a data classification policy, but it's really just written, right, and it's supposed to be followed. So something like sensitivity labels allows you to adopt that data classification policy, but there's so much more that goes with it. So really the number one thing that we found is, user adoption around this. So not even the policy component, but like you said, users being aware that these tools are out there, right? And things can be enforced. They'll see sensitivity labels in the Office applications, on their mobile devices, in the browser. So it's really important to get the user communications, user adoption aspects out there in front of the users, as quickly as possible to help them align, which is the overall mission, right, of securing data or even Gen AI in this case. But it used to be, I believe you mentioned the term that we had, which was crawl, walk, run, right? So that's still a strategy. It's kind of like slowly deploy in groups, right? Get feedback, deploy to larger groups. But Microsoft has actually developed kind of a newer strategy that's recommended. So we call it secure by default. And it's kind of a new way of thinking. And even my team has kind of developed like a hybrid of the approach of the new and the old. But secure by default is the idea of getting labels in front of users, as quickly as possible, and then moving into more enforcement capabilities like default labels for new documents, right? Or containers, which represents things like SharePoint Online, Teams channels. So you really hit the ground running with current content and newly created content, and then kind of address older content with things like auto labeling. So that's definitely an approach that can be done. So it's a different way of thinking about it that might help really address, Gen AI and everything that we've been talking about, and kind of have things fall into place. The hybrid part that we've developed is kind of secure by default, get all labels deployed to all users, and then as like a phase two, start with the defaults, right? So if you look at secure by default with Microsoft, they kind of want you to do defaults right away too. So it's all about your user, adoption, as we said, and the level that they're able to take on depending on your organization. Lots of variables, but getting that information, getting data labeled, sensitive data labeled quickly allows you to adopt all the rest of these protection mechanisms that we discussed. So.
Yeah, I think when we look at it, kind of ties back to what Rich said, Chris, as far as you have some governance in place, you have some leadership, stakeholder involvement when it comes to rollout of the tools, and then having user adoption, good communications, right, and actually being able to do that. So getting those labels in front of people in particular, that can be impactful to user workload, right? So just making sure that there's alignment from a business perspective and that you're communicating openly with the user and getting the adoption in place is an area that I think is hard for organizations, right? But it is a crawl, walk around of start getting it out there. It's pretty cool actually to hear you've got some modernized techniques that your team is using to help companies with that, Chris. It's definitely a pain point. So with that, so maybe we could dive into governance too, so that you get past the protection of these tools, but then there's like the run state, right? What do you do there, Chris? It's definitely a pretty deep topic on its own.
Yep, definitely. And one of the items listed there, Purview audit capabilities. So there's not only admin components that are audited around Purview from an access standpoint and any type of changes that happen from an administrative standpoint, but also all activity throughout Microsoft 365 and even other connected apps that kind of flow into this telemetry. So being able to use that data to track various items, specifically even around Gen AI as well, is now incorporated into that. And then another item that was mentioned is activity explorers. So when I mentioned like endpoint DLP, all activities on the endpoint can be tracked to a very finite detail level that's fed into the activity explorer. But also it goes across things like sensitivity labeling. So understanding your adoption of labeling from an operational standpoint, you can start to see that users are using labeling, right? The default labels are taking place. You can really track that kind of a adoption curve with the various technologies. So all that that data is there, even including like anomalies with AI related access scenarios. Um, Part of that too is retention and records management. So as Rich mentioned as well, if you have stale data and these tools are looking at the stale data, you're getting bad results essentially. So understanding what your lifecycle management and retention policies are and being able to enforce them with the various tools in Purview allows you to kind of have the most accurate data for these tools as part of the strategy, right? It's an ongoing set of capabilities that manages the life cycle in various ways, even what's called like event-based retention. So as a contract expires, it can kick off a different event and different retention scenarios. So um, definitely one of those key pieces to keep it operational, have it in a good state. And then another piece is compliance manager, which really is all about tracking kind of regulatory frameworks, right? So being able to track the controls within those regulatory frameworks and what will be added, right, as these are adjusted to Gen AI overall, those newer controls will be added in that map back to, the Purview capabilities that you are looking to deploy. And then finally, listed there is e-discovery. So, the discoverability of this information now, the prompts people are using, the responses that they're getting, that becomes a large part of this, whereas, is traditionally around the rest of the workloads, right? So it's an entirely new thought process around e-discovery and the conversations that go with that. So there's a lot to that from an operational standpoint, but kind of looking at the full journey as we've been mentioning it, right? Discovering the data, enabling the tools, kind of taking on specialized components to really tune those tools, and then you get you to that more operational data-driven state where you know not gonna lie in any way, there's a ton of data, right? It's there's an operational aspect. We do find clients looking at kind of like managed services around compliance at this point in time as well. So there's definitely a lot to it, but you can see kind of the framework here that's listed really helps you kind of put things into place and just understand how they fall into the Purview tools that either your own or you're looking at. So.
Yeah, actually, I liked there at the end, Chris. One of the things that is good to point out, it is one thing to understand the risk, put the protections in place, but there definitely is an operational state here when it comes to managing these tools and keeping your data security in place. I think within that though, what you kind of articulate, Chris, which I liked. I mean, it's connected to a lot of the tools, right? So while there is some care and feed here for the data security piece of this, it is connected to a lot of the other things in like the Microsoft suite, like Defender and insider risk policies, conditional access. So there's a little bit of an overlay as far as like the maintenance of this does help other tools. How do you had mentioned clients in this case, like what are you seeing out there as far as clients, they implementing dedicated staff or they kind of integrate this into their security teams as far as how they handle that? I'm kind of curious in some of the strategies you've seen.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of what I was mentioning. It's really a mix of everything there, right? There's points that can be kind of overwhelming from who handles the alerts that come out of DLP or insider risk, or even the policy management, like risk. Rich mentioned, right? What teams are owning these different features, right? So it becomes kind of some complicated conversations, right, from that perspective. So definitely seeing a mix across the board, but a lot of clients are asking for kind of like a managed compliance capability, right? Used to manage SOC from a security standpoint, but now really wrapped around compliance, purview, and those capabilities. So
Great. Appreciate you, Chris, really going into that finer detail as it relates to Purview. It's a deep topic. We did cover a pretty wide topic or deep depth in the topic of Gen AI and security. So, Rich kind of started us off looking at governance, strategy, articulating that problem, working with your business, and understanding it, and then what are some of the techniques and tools people are using. As we mentioned, Microsoft Purview, it's a great tool set, and Chris, really, you helped frame that up. It is a big journey, but you can kind of break it down into pieces, and does start with a good engagement, and then actually putting that in place. So hopefully, everybody today walks out, maybe having a deeper understanding of where that gap is, why it's concerning, and there are available processes, tools, and people out there that can get you in the right path. As a reminder, we did also cover in the last webinar that should be linked in the link for Bright Talk where we covered the broader topic of securing Gen AI. Today's focus on data security. Additionally, we do monitor the question and answer area, even if you're watching this after the live recording. So please feel free to put comments or questions in. If we can't address them directly in the webinar, we'll make sure we address those after the fact and a follow-up through an email. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks.